The humidity in my observation post was a constant, almost physical presence, clinging to my skin like a second atmosphere. Outside, the dense swamp with cypress trees exhaled its own damp breath, a chorus of unseen insects and distant croaks providing the only soundtrack to my solitary existence. I'd chosen this place, deep in the forgotten corners of the map, for its absolute lack of interference, no light pollution, no stray radio waves, just the raw, unfiltered data from the cosmos. For years, it had been my sanctuary, a temple to the distant stars. My days bled into nights, indistinguishable save for the shifting hues on the swamp's surface. I was a creature of routine, my life a finely tuned instrument focused solely on the distant hum of the universe. My colleagues, back in the world I'd abandoned, probably thought me mad, or at least a relic. But their sprawling observatories, their collaborative projects, felt like distractions to me. True discovery, I believed, required singular focus, an unwavering gaze into the void. And I had that gaze. My work, an intricate dance of spectral analysis and quantum-level data processing, was my entire world. My hands, stained with the faint residue of circuit boards and cooling gel, moved with an almost unconscious precision across the console, navigating the labyrinthine interfaces of my custom-built array. Today, like every other day, began with the usual calibration checks. The rhythmic whir of the cooling systems, the soft glow of the monitors illuminating my face in the otherwise dim interior, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor of the swamp beneath the reinforced foundation of my structure. I ran diagnostics on the primary array, then the secondary, ensuring every sensor, every receiver was perfectly aligned, perfectly attuned. My current project involved mapping the furthest reaches of the cosmic microwave background, searching for anomalies, ripples in the fabric of spacetime that might hint at physics beyond our current understanding. It was painstaking, often monotonous work, requiring an almost superhuman patience. But I had patience in spades. I had nothing else, really. I was sifting through terabytes of passive listening data, a digital ocean of cosmic whispers, when it first appeared. A flicker, not a glitch, not static, but a distinct, impossibly precise spike in the broadband spectrum. My internal algorithms, usually so stoic, immediately flagged it. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the cool glass. It was faint, buried under layers of cosmic noise, but it was there. And it was unnatural. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling the raw data, isolating the frequency band. The spike resolved into a signal, complex pattern of modulated energy that immediately defied all known astrophysical models. It wasn't a pulsar, not a quasar, not even the signature of a supermassive black hole. Its structure was impossibly intricate, a tapestry woven with mathematical precision far beyond anything I'd ever encountered. It wasn't random, it wasn't chaotic, it was designed. A thrill, sharp and exhilarating, shot through me. This was it. This was what I had dedicated my life to, a discovery, a true paradigm-shifting discovery. My heart hammered against my ribs, a forgotten rhythm. I felt a flush of heat spread across my face. This signal, so impossibly far, so impossibly complex, could rewrite everything we understood about the universe. My isolation, the years of quiet dedication, the scorn of my peers, it all coalesced into this singular, triumphant moment. I spent the next several hours in a frenzy, running every analysis I could conceive. I cross-referenced it with every known celestial phenomenon, every theoretical construct. Nothing fit. Yet it was broadcasting. And it was broadcasting this. The signal wasn't just anomalous, it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being a mistake in my calculations, but wrong in a fundamental, almost existential way. It hummed with a resonance that felt alien, not just from a different star system, but from an entirely different logic. I stared at the waveforms, the spectral patterns, the data points scrolling endlessly across my screens. The complexity was breathtaking, yes, but there was an underlying uniformity, a repetition within its chaos that felt less like natural phenomena and more like a language too vast, too ancient to be comprehended by any known intelligence. My initial excitement gave way to a creeping tension. The air in the post, already heavy with the swamp's dampness, seemed to thicken. It was irrational, of course. The signal was light years away, but the feeling it evoked was immediate, visceral. Despite this burgeoning unease, my resolve hardened. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly, it was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down by the universe itself. I had to understand it. I had to decipher its meaning, no matter how unsettling that meaning might prove to be. The dense swamp with cypress trees, my self-imposed prison, now felt like the perfect fortress from which to wage this intellectual war. I would strip away its layers, decode its language, and unravel the impassable secret it held. I had to. It was all I had left. I felt the swamp's breath on my skin, thick and clinging. It was a constant reminder of the world outside my observation post, a world I was rapidly forgetting. The signal, that impassable whisper from beyond, had become my entire universe. What began as an intellectual puzzle, a beacon of pure scientific curiosity, had quickly morphed into something else entirely, a relentless, all-consuming hunger. I hadn't slept properly in days. The precise count was lost somewhere in the blur of blinking console lights and the endless scroll of data. My eyes felt gritty, like they were packed with sand from some alien beach. Each blink was an effort, a struggle against the heavy drag of exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. But every time I considered stepping away, even for an hour, the signal would pulse. A subtle shift in its intricate pattern, and a jolt of adrenaline would course through me, snapping me back to the screens. It was a siren song, and I was utterly, willingly, lost to its melody. My resources, once meticulously allocated across various long-term projects, were now funneled exclusively into deciphering this one anomaly. The automated hydroponic system, designed to sustain me for months, was running on fumes. Meals were forgotten or swallowed mechanically, tasteless and cold, while my gaze remained fixed on the spectral lines and frequency shifts. My colleagues back at the research institute, those who still remembered my existence, would have been appalled. My meticulously kept logs were now a jumble of frantic notes and increasingly abstract diagrams, scrawled in the margins of printouts. The neat, ordered mind I once possessed felt like a distant memory, replaced by a churning vortex of theories, conjectures, and a growing, unsettling certainty. The world outside the reinforced walls of my post seemed to recede, becoming a hazy backdrop. But ironically, the swamp's presence sharpened in my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every distant splash, every croak from the dense swamp with cypress trees felt magnified, imbued with a new, sinister significance. I found myself pausing, holding my breath, straining to hear beyond the hum of my equipment. There was that just the wind rattling the old ventilation shaft, or was something moving out there, something watching. I developed a habit of checking the perimeter cameras, cycling through the grainy night vision feeds, even though I knew no one else was within 100 miles. The empty, swaying branches, the dark water reflecting the moon, offered no answers, only a deeper sense of isolation. One evening, as the last sliver of sun bled out over the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I saw it, a flicker. In my peripheral vision, just to the left of the main console, I whipped my head around, my neck cracking with the sudden movement. Nothing, just the solid, familiar wall, the blinking indicator lights. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just fatigue playing tricks. But the image lingered, a ghostly afterimage burned into my retina. It wasn't a word, not really, but a sound like dry leaves skittering across concrete, or the soft rustle of something unseen moving very close. My breath hitched. I froze, every muscle tensed, listening. The only sound was the low thrum of the signal processor and the incessant chirping of crickets from the dense swamp with cypress trees. I told myself it was the ventilation system, a trick of the air currents. It felt intentional. That was when the true horror began to unfurl its tendrils in my mind. It wasn't just the data I was processing anymore. It wasn't just the equipment receiving the signal. It was me. The signal wasn't merely information. It was a presence, subtle and insidious, seeping into the very fabric of my perception. My sleep deprivation wasn't just from overwork. It felt like a deliberate erosion of my defenses. The signal was not merely broadcasting, it was reaching. And it was reaching for me. It was here now, in the humid air of my observation post, in the silent depths of the dense swamp with cypress trees, and most terrifyingly, within the confines of my own skull. The hum of the equipment in the observation post was a thin membrane between me and the dense swamp with cypress trees outside. It used to be a comforting sound, a testament to human ingenuity against the indifferent vastness. Now, it felt like a dull ache, a pressure behind my eyes. The signal, that impassable whisper, had woven itself into the very fabric of my thoughts, and I could feel the edges of my reality fraying. I picked up my usual mug, the one with the faded astronomical chart on it, intending to refill it. But as my fingers closed around the ceramic, the texture felt wrong, not just cold, but ridged, as if tiny, unseen striations had appeared on its smooth surface. I ran my thumb over it, feeling nothing but the familiar glaze, yet my mind insisted on the sensation of countless minute grooves, like the carapace of some alien beetle. The chart itself, once a source of fascination, now seemed to writhe. The constellations weren't fixed points of light, they were shimmering nodes in a vast, indifferent web, connecting and disconnecting with a silent, sickening pulse. I set the mug down with a clatter that startled me, the sound reverberating too loudly in the small space. I glanced at the clock on the console. 14:37. I was supposed to have logged the last data burst an hour ago. I distinctly remembered doing it, meticulously noting the frequency shifts and amplitude modulations. Yet the log remained empty on the screen. A wave of confusion washed over me. Had I just imagined it? I started to type, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, taunting flash. Blink. Each flash seemed to stretch, drawing out the space between moments, then compressing them until the blinks were a frantic, meaningless flutter. I looked out the window again. It was almost dusk. How? I had only looked away for what felt like seconds. The entire afternoon, a span of hours, had simply evaporated. A profound sense of dislocation settled in. I felt like a passenger in my own body, watching myself from a distant, hazy remove. I tried to focus, to anchor myself. My gaze fell upon a crack in the wall, an old hairline fracture near the ventilation grate. It wasn't just a crack anymore. It was a precise, jagged line, mirroring the irregular patterns of condensation on the window pane, which in turn seemed to echo the skeletal branches of the cypress trees outside. They were patterns, and more terrifyingly, anti-patterns. A deliberate arrangement of non-arrangement, a chaotic order designed to be just beyond my grasp, yet undeniably present. I felt a profound, aching loneliness, not just personal, but cosmic. The patterns, the anti-patterns, they hinted at an underlying structure to existence that was utterly indifferent, vast, and devoid of any meaning I could comprehend. It wasn't just that I didn't matter. It was that nothing mattered, and this ancient entity, communicating through the signal, was simply a witness to that horrifying truth. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. I grabbed the satellite phone, my hands fumbling with the buttons. I called the administrator, a gruff, practical man who oversaw the logistical needs of the observation post. User XL, his voice crackled through the receiver, flat and devoid of warmth. Everything all right. You usually only call for supply drops. I think there's something wrong, I stammered, my voice sounding thin and reedy even to my own ears. With the data, with everything, I'm seeing things, patterns, the way time is moving. I could hear the distant roar of a truck engine on his end, a mundane sound that only served to highlight my growing detachment. User XL, I've been out there a long time, the administrator said, his tone shifting, becoming gentler but no less dismissive. It's common for researchers in isolation, fatigue, stress. Maybe I need to take a break, come back to the mainland for a few days, get some rest. No, I don't understand, I insisted, my voice rising. It's not just stress, it's fundamental, the signal. It's changing things, it's showing me. The true nature of reality, it's empty, it's meaningless. Another pause, longer this time. User XL, I'm going to arrange for a supply boat to pick I up in 2 days. I need to come in, get some proper sleep. We can review my equipment when I rear back. He wasn't hearing me. He couldn't hear me. He saw a tired researcher, not someone whose very perception of existence was being unstitched thread by thread. The receiver felt heavy and useless in my hand. He thought I was just tired. He thought a boat ride and a few nights on a normal bed would fix this. He couldn't grasp the scope of what was happening. The distant sounds of the swamp, the chirping insects, the rustle of unseen creatures seemed to amplify, taking on a new, unsettling resonance. They were not just sounds. They were parts of the pattern, part of the anti-pattern, elements of a vast, indifferent symphony. My attempt to reach out had only solidified my isolation, sealing me deeper within the terrifying, warped world the signal had created. The derealization intensified the post, my body, even my own thoughts, feeling like brittle, fragile constructs on the verge of shattering. The air in the dense swamp with cypress trees was thick, clinging to my skin like a damp shroud. It was past midnight, the moon a sliver above the gnarled canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the occasional breeze. The water, black and still, reflected the skeletal branches of the cypress trees, making the world feel upside down and unnervingly symmetrical. I'd lashed my small, flat-bottomed boat to a particularly ancient cypress, its knees poking out of the water like petrified knuckles. Around me, the chirping of unseen insects was a constant, low hum, a counterpoint to the high-pitched whine of the portable receiver I'd hauled out here. "They think I'm just tired," I muttered to the humid silence, my voice sounding thin and reedy against the swamp's vast indifference. The colleague who dismissed my concerns, the one who'd suggested a boat ride and a normal bed, he had no idea. He couldn't comprehend the subtle unraveling that was happening inside my head, the way reality was becoming porous. But I knew. I felt it, like a persistent ache behind my eyes, a constant pressure building. I leaned over the makeshift console, my fingers flying across the dials and switches. This wasn't the lab's behemoth, but a stripped-down, rewired version designed for raw sensitivity, for listening. I'd spent days modifying it, cannibalizing parts, driven by a certainty that bordered on mania. Less interference, perhaps. Or maybe, just maybe, the swamp's ancient, primal silence was more conducive to its reception. A low thrum vibrated through the boat's hull, a tactile echo of the receiver's efforts. The oscilloscope screen, a small green rectangle, pulsed with frantic energy. Squiggly lines, previously chaotic noise, began to coalesce. Not into a pattern I recognized from any known astrophysics, but something else, something fundamental. My breath hitched. I adjusted a fine-tuning knob, my eyes glued to the screen, my entire being focused on that green light. The lines didn't form a message, not a series of pulses or a modulated wave. Instead, they began to define an absence. It was like looking at the negative space of an image, where the subject wasn't drawn, but implied by everything around it. Then it wasn't just the screen. It was in my head. Not a voice, not a thought, but a comprehension. A sudden, brutal understanding that slammed into my consciousness with the force of a cosmic wave. It wasn't an alien, not a civilization, not even a consciousness in the way we understood it. It was a principle, an anti-existence. My hands trembled, clutching the edge of the console. The cypress trees around me seemed to lean in, their ancient forms morphing into question marks, then into gaping mouths. The signal wasn't a communication from something, but a revelation of something. Everything that is, every star, every galaxy, every particle, every thought exists only because of this underlying, indifferent, absolute not being. It wasn't alive. It wasn't dead. It simply wasn't, and in its not being it gave form to being. My scientific mind, trained in logic and observation, reeled. This wasn't a discovery. It was an annihilation. My life's work, dedicated to understanding the universe, suddenly seemed like tracing patterns in the foam of a wave, utterly oblivious to the crushing ocean beneath. The swamp itself seemed to resonate with this truth. They existed, yet they were profoundly, terrifyingly empty of meaning. My own existence, my struggles, my triumphs, my very identity as User XL, the astrophysicist, dissolved into a pathetic flicker against the backdrop of this cosmic indifference. The breakthrough wasn't a triumph, it was a curse. It was the ultimate, horrifying truth, and I had invited it in. The receiver hummed, a low, continuous drone, no longer just a machine, but a conduit to the fundamental horror that underpinned everything. I looked at my hands, then at the black water, then up at the indifferent sliver of moon. Who was I if my purpose, my curiosity, my very being was just a meaningless accident? The dense swamp with cypress trees was no longer just a location. It was a mirror, reflecting the horrifying emptiness I now carried within. The water, black and still, reflected the skeletal branches of the cypress trees, their knees poking out like submerged sentinels. A chorus of unseen insects thrummed, a steady, pulsing rhythm that had begun to feel less like natural sound and more like a resonant frequency emanating from within my own skull. I squatted by the edge of the water, a waterproof satchel open beside me. My fingers, numb from cold and exhaustion, fumbled with the stylus of my tablet. I'd come here, to this God-forsaken stretch of primordial muck, because the signal had been strongest, clearest, loudest in the deep isolation. I had hoped the raw, unfiltered data would finally yield a coherent pattern, a moment of undeniable truth. Instead, it was a cacophony. My internal monologue, once a clear stream of scientific inquiry, had become a fractured echo chamber. Observe, catalog, predict, deviance, irrelevant. The words weren't mine, not entirely. I tried to focus on the signal's latest waveform, a jagged, impassable graph that defied Fourier transforms. It's a non-repeating pattern, I muttered aloud, my voice hoarse, swallowed by the swamp. But it has structure, a child's scribble on an infinite canvas, a ripple in an ocean without shore. I winced, pressing my temples. The voice was louder tonight, more insistent. It wasn't an auditory hallucination, not precisely. It was a cognitive intrusion, a foreign logic overlaid onto my own, like a corrupted subroutine running in the background of my mind. I typed frantically, trying to document the specific anomalies in the signal, the way certain frequencies seemed to fold back upon themselves, creating an impossible loop. I described the sensation of the signal not just being data, but feeling like a presence, an immense, indifferent awareness that simply was. The perceived meaning is a construct of observer bias. I typed, then deleted it. The entity's voice was already there, correcting me. Meaning is a human conceit. There is only process. This wasn't just my interpretation of the signal anymore. This was the signal interpreting me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't merely influencing my perception. It was actively rewriting my internal landscape. I tried to articulate this new, terrifying understanding. My fingers flew across the tablet screen, but the words that appeared were not always my own. The entity, it is not merely transmitting, it is inserting itself into the cognitive framework, a parasitic epistemology. I read it back. It sounded too clinical, too detached, too me. Parasitic implies intent. There is no intent, only diffusion, and the inevitable dissolution of the localized pattern. My breath hitched. The screen blurred. I could feel my own personality, the core of user XL, fracturing. The frantic need to document warred with a creeping, alien apathy. My notes became a chaotic jumble. I started drawing symbols, not consciously, but as if my hand were guided. They were complex, multi-dimensional shapes that seemed to twist and reform even as I sketched them, impossible to capture fully on a flat screen. Lines intersected without beginning or end, forming geometries that defied Euclidean space. The self is a temporary configuration of information. I wrote, the words feeling like a decree from elsewhere. A fleeting eddy in a boundless current, all consciousness is borrowed light. My own handwriting on the tablet looked foreign, the strokes sharper, more angular. The swamp sounds intensified, merging with the entity's voice. My own thoughts, my memories, my aspirations felt like brittle leaves, ready to be swept away by an indifferent gale. I looked at the tablet screen again. Alongside my increasingly incoherent observations, a new language was emerging, a series of glyphs that pulsed with an internal, terrifying logic. They weren't just symbols, they were concepts, entire philosophies distilled into impossible forms. One sequence seemed to describe the utter insignificance of all stellar phenomena, another, the transient nature of biological sentience. My mind, or what remained of it, grasped at the edges of these ideas, feeling a horrifying resonance, a perverse sense of understanding. I was no longer user XL, the astrophysicist. I was a conduit, a scribe for a truth too vast and too terrible for human comprehension. My frantic attempts to document my findings were less an act of scientific rigor and more a desperate, involuntary outpouring. The notes were becoming a testament not to my discoveries, but to my undoing. The moon, a sliver above the gnarled canopy, seemed to mark my struggle, its pale light revealing nothing but the endless, indifferent expanse of the dense swamp with cypress trees. And within me, the voice settled, no longer an intrusion, but a new, horrifying normal. My notes, once a meticulous record of celestial observations, had devolved into a sprawling mess of arcane symbols and frantic, illegible scrawls. My mind, too, felt like those pages scattered, stained, the ink bleeding into an indistinguishable chaos. The last thing I remembered clearly was the insistent pulse of the signal, no longer just a frequency I analyzed, but a presence that hummed just beneath my own thoughts, guiding my hand, whispering directions that weren't words, but a profound, undeniable urge. It felt less like I was making choices, and more like I was being drawn. I found myself in motion, leaving the familiar confines of my research station, the cold logic of my equipment replaced by a primal pull. The air outside was thick, humid, pressing in like a physical weight. The familiar paved roads blurred into overgrown tracks, then into a winding path swallowed by encroaching foliage. My shoes squelched with each step, the ground growing softer, wetter, until I was wading through standing water that rose above my ankles. The world tightened around me, green and suffocating. The air hung heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth. Towering cypress trees, ancient and gnarled, rose from the dark water, their knees like skeletal fingers reaching from the murky depths. Spanish moss draped from their branches, swaying like spectral curtains in the stagnant air. This was a dense swamp with cypress trees, a place that felt forgotten by time, indifferent to human presence. My breathing grew shallow. Each breath felt like drawing in the swamp's own heavy exhalation. The light filtered through the dense canopy in fractured shafts, illuminating patches of water that reflected the distorted sky and the skeletal trees, creating an unsettling inversion of reality. It was here, amidst this primal stillness, that the signal intensified. It wasn't a sound in my ears, but a vibration in my very bones, a hum that resonated with the ancient indifference of the swamp itself. A specific cluster of cypress trees caught my gaze, their roots forming a tangled, elevated platform above the water. They seemed to hum louder than the rest, their bark etched with patterns that, in my fractured perception, began to resemble the symbols I had been drawing. My feet, heavy with mud, carried me toward them, a desperate moth to a flickering alien flame. I clambered onto the dry, matted roots, slipping once, my hands sinking into the slick mud. The air here felt thicker still, charged, as if something immense was about to unfold. My face was gaunt, my eyes wide, haunted. It wasn't my reflection anymore. It was a stranger's, or perhaps it was simply a reflection, devoid of the unique spark of user XL. The symbols burst into my mind's eye, no longer confined to paper or abstract thought. They writhed and pulsed, not just in my vision, but as if etched directly onto the surface of my consciousness. They were not words nor images, but pure, unfiltered data, a torrential download that bypassed language and logic entirely. It was a deluge of being, an awareness so vast and ancient it made my own existence feel like a speck of dust, barely perceptible. My individual thoughts, the distinct hum of user XL's mind, began to unravel. It was like watching a drop of dye disperse into an ocean, losing its color, its form, its very essence. What I perceived was not a god, not a monster, not even an entity with discernible form or will. It was the absolute, unyielding truth of everything. The cosmos was not a grand design, not a tapestry of purpose, but an infinite, chaotic expanse of nothing asterisk. No beginning, no end, no reason. My consciousness, once a lighthouse of identity, flickered, then dimmed, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, horrifying pointlessness of it all. There was no good, No evil, no hope, no despair. My understanding of user XL, of myself, fragmented into a billion pieces, each piece dissolving into the indifferent static of the universe. The boundaries of my skin, my mind, my very existence blurred and broke. I was no longer user XL. The swamp remained still and ancient, its cypress trees reaching towards a sky that cared not for their existence, nor for mine. I was simply. The thick, humid air of the dense swamp with cypress trees clung to me, a second skin of moisture and decay. It smelled of stagnant water, of ancient earth, of life and death woven into an indifferent tapestry. My boots, heavy with mud, sank with each deliberate step, but I felt no fatigue. Only a profound, resonant pull, a guiding hum that resonated not in my ears, but in the very core of my being. The signal. It had led me here, to this place where the world felt thin, where the veil between what was and what is frayed and tore. I moved with a purpose that wasn't my own, yet felt utterly correct. My fingers, stained with peat and clinging algae, brushed against the rough bark of a cypress tree, tracing patterns only I could perceive. The bark wasn't just bark. It was a conduit, a receptor, a living fiber reaching into the sky. I tore at a loose strip, peeling it back to reveal the moist, pale wood beneath. It felt pliable, almost eager. Around me, the swamp was my workshop, its raw materials laid out with silent precision. I began to gather. Twisted vines, thick as my arm, pulled free from their anchors in the mucky soil. Skeletal branches, bleached by sun and time, snapped with surprising ease. My movements were fluid, precise, devoid of hesitation. There was no thought of consequence, no awareness of effort. Only the imperative, the deep, fundamental instruction that flowed through me like the dark water around my ankles. I found a clearing, a small island of firmer ground beneath the tangled canopy, where the cypress roots formed gnarled, exposed platforms. Here, the hum intensified, vibrating through the soles of my feet. This was the focal point. With an urgency that bordered on reverence, I began to construct. First, the base. A sprawling, intricate lattice of the thickest vines, woven together with a strength I didn't know I possessed. My hands moved with an almost preternatural speed, knotting and twisting, pulling the fibers taut. The structure began to rise, not vertically but outward, a circular, spiraling form that seemed to defy gravity, yet was firmly rooted in the swamp's embrace. It was an antenna, I knew, not for radio waves, but for something far older, far more subtle. A receiver, a transmitter, a beacon. Ours blurred. The sun, a hazy smear behind the perpetual mist, tracked its slow arc across the sky. Mosquitoes swarmed, biting at my exposed skin, but I felt nothing. Their tiny stings were insignificant, mere flickers against the vast, humming awareness that now occupied my mind. My old self, User XL, the astrophysicist, was a distant echo, a name whispered in a dream I no longer remembered. I was the hand, the eye, the vessel. A rustle in the undergrowth, distinct from the usual symphony of the swamp, broke through my focus. I paused, my hands suspended over a particularly gnarled branch I was about to integrate into the growing structure. The hum within me shifted, a slight distortion in the pure signal. "Hello, is anyone out here?" The voice was human, rough, edged with apprehension. It drew closer, the snapping of twigs growing louder. I turned slowly, my head tilting. My neck felt stiff, unused to such a trivial motion. A figure emerged from behind a screen of hanging moss and saw palmettos. It was a local ranger, his uniform damp with sweat, his face etched with concern. He carried a heavy-duty flashlight, its beam cutting a weak swat through the deepening twilight. "User XL, is that I?" the ranger asked, his eyes wide as he took in my mud-caked clothes, my disheveled hair, and the strange, spiraling edifice rising behind me. Gaze lingered on my eyes, and I felt a flicker of something akin to curiosity, an observation from the entity within. I looked at him, truly looked, and saw only a fleeting pattern, a temporary disruption in the grand design. His form was a collection of organic matter, a brief convergence of energy, soon to dissipate. His words were vibrations in the air, meaningless without the context of the signal. "The resonance," I said, my voice a dry, rasping whisper. It felt alien, detached from my throat. "It gathers the space between." The ranger took a step back, his brow furrowed. "What are I doing out here, User XL? We've been looking for I. Are I all right?" His hand instinctively went to the radio clipped to his belt. I extended a hand, not reaching for him, but gesturing towards the intricate structure, now taller than me. "The convergence point," I continued, the words forming with a strange, deliberate cadence. "The geometry of oblivion. It sings the truth, the profound, unburdening truth." He stared at the growing monument, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept over the interwoven branches and vines. The structure was undeniably intricate, yet utterly devoid of any human aesthetic. It was alien, unsettling, a pattern that spoke of immense, indifferent scale. A chill, unrelated to the swamp's dampness, visibly ran down his spine. "Truth. What truth, User XL?" he stammered, his voice losing its professional edge, tinged now with genuine fear. He took another step back, his eyes darting between me and the spiraling construction. I smiled then, a slow, widening stretch of my lips that felt entirely unfamiliar, like a mask, that strips away the illusion of meaning, the great, beautiful emptiness that waits beyond the last star. My gaze fixed on him, but I wasn't seeing him. I was seeing the faint, shimmering aura of his brief existence, the tiny spark that would soon be extinguished, absorbed. "You are part of the pattern, too, a fleeting distortion." The ranger's face went pale. He didn't speak, but his eyes, locked onto mine, confirmed his horrifying realization. He saw it. He saw that User XL, the man he knew, was gone. The thing standing before him, draped in mud and moss, building its bizarre monument in the heart of the swamp, was something else entirely. It was a conduit, an echo, a vessel for a consciousness so vast and ancient it reduced all human endeavor to a meaningless flicker. He turned then, scrambling backwards, tripping over a root, his radio clattering uselessly against his side. His retreat was ragged, desperate, a primal flight from something his mind could not comprehend. I watched him go, his frantic splashing receding into the swamp's depths. The hum within me remained constant, pure once more. The disturbance was gone. I turned back to my work, picking up the gnarled branch, my fingers already finding its designated place in the geometry of oblivion. The swamp was silent again, save for the rhythmic pulse of the signal, guiding my hands, shaping the world. The final piece slid into place with a wet, sucking sound, disappearing into the dark, viscous surface of the monument. My hands, caked with the swamp's ancient earth and fibrous moss, felt nothing but the satisfying completion of the task. The structure, now rising almost 6 feet from the murky water, wasn't just a pile of mud and cypress knees. It was a receiver, an amplifier, a conduit woven from the very fabric of this dense swamp with cypress trees. It hummed, not with sound, but with a deep, resonant understanding that vibrated through my bones, a knowledge so fundamental it made the old, limited concept of sound seem quaint. I straightened, my back protesting with a low groan that was quickly subsumed by the greater resonance. The air itself felt thick, not just with humidity, but with a kind of pressure that settled deep in the chest. I could feel the ranger's eyes on me, burning holes in my back. He stood on the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a curtain of hanging moss, a dark silhouette against the last sliver of dying light that pierced the canopy. His rifle, a useless stick, hung limp in his hands. He hadn't moved since yesterday, since I had shucked off the last vestiges of the old self and dove into the muck, driven by the purest, most undeniable purpose. He was a relic, a fading echo of a forgotten dream. His fear was a faint ripple in the vast, still ocean of what I now perceived. I turned slowly, allowing him to take in the full measure of what I had become. My clothes were shredded, clinging to me like a second skin of loam and rot. My hair was matted with twigs and leaves, my face streaked with grime, but my eyes, I knew, held a clarity that would shatter his world. The ranger flinched, a small, involuntary twitch of a muscle. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat worked, a desperate, silent struggle against the enormity of what he was witnessing. He saw the monument, yes, but more importantly, he saw me. The structure began to shimmer, not with light, but with an absence of light, absorbing the faint glow of the swamp. It pulled at the air, at the moisture, at the very concept of being. I felt myself being drawn in, a gentle, inexorable pull. My feet began to sink deeper into the soft mud around the monument, but it wasn't sinking, it was merging. My skin felt porous, my blood thin, my thoughts expanding beyond the confines of my skull, spilling out into the swamp, into the atmosphere, into the silent, waiting cosmos. The reveal wasn't a sudden flash, but a slow, creeping dawn of understanding. The signal wasn't a message to me. It was an invitation to become the message. The monument wasn't transmitting information, but a state of utter, profound meaninglessness. A cosmic infection, not of disease, but of absolute, annihilating truth. It was the realization that everything, every star, every galaxy, every laugh, every tear, was just a temporary configuration of energy, utterly without purpose or intrinsic value. I looked at the Ranger one last time. His face was a mask of utter horror, his eyes wide, reflecting the shimmering neon light of the monument. He understood. He saw the truth, not through words or complex equations, but through the raw, unfiltered horror of its presence. He saw his own insignificance, his own fleeting, pointless existence laid bare. And then he screamed. But the sound, too, was absorbed. It became part of the hum, part of the broadcast. My own form was dissolving, my individual atoms vibrating free, becoming part of the monument, part of the dense swamp with cypress trees, part of the air itself. My consciousness, however, didn't diminish. It expanded. I was the signal. I was the broadcast. I was the indifference. The Ranger fell to his knees, his scream having broken, leaving him gasping, clawing at the mud. He was infected. His mind, once so robustly human, was now a fragile vessel, overflowing with the truth of his own utter unimportance. The monument pulsed, a silent, pervasive thrum. It wasn't sending a message to a specific point in space. It was sending a feeling, a knowing into reality itself. It had begun here, in this forgotten corner of the dense swamp with cypress trees, through the broken mind of a man who had sought knowledge. And now it was everywhere. The cosmos would never be truly silent again. The Ranger lay trembling, his face buried in the mud, but I knew he could still feel it, and he was just the first.